Bullies stripped her coat in winter. She slammed them without hesitation. The morning fog hung thick over the suburban streets as 17-year-old Marcus Dano stood before the imposing glass doors of Westfield High School. It was his third day at this new institution, the fourth school in as many years since his father's death. His worn backpack, a military surplus model his father had given him years ago, hung heavily on his narrow shoulders. The straps had been adjusted and readjusted so many times that the fabric was beginning to fray, but Marcus couldn't bring himself to replace it. It was one of the few tangible connections he had left. Standing at barely 5 feet 7 inches, Marcus knew he didn't cut an imposing figure. His messy brown hair perpetually defied any attempt at styling, falling across his forehead in uneven waves that his mother had given up trying to tame years ago. His clothes, always slightly too large or too small, never quite fitting right, came from discount stores and second-hand shops. Not because his family was destitute, but because his mother saved every penny she could for his college fund, determined that her son would have opportunities she never had. What his new classmates at Westfield High didn't know, couldn't possibly know from looking at his unassuming exterior, was that beneath the ill-fitting flannel shirt and faded jeans lay 15 years of rigorous training in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Not the weekend warrior variety taught at strip mall dojos, but the real thing, learned from his father, who had spent 2 decades in special forces before a roadside bomb in Afghanistan sent him home with wounds that would eventually claim his life. Marcus touched the small medallion hanging beneath his shirt, a St. Michael pendant his father had worn on every deployment. He could still hear his father's voice, raspy from the medications, but still commanding respect. Strength isn't about hurting people, son. It's about protecting them. The moment you use your skills for anything other than defense, you become the very thing we're supposed to fight against. The hallways of Westfield High buzzed with their usual morning chaos. Students clustered around rows of beige lockers, their conversations creating a cacophony of teenage drama, weekend recaps, and complaints about upcoming tests. The smell of industrial cleaning products mixed with cheap body spray and cafeteria breakfast created an atmosphere uniquely characteristic of American high schools. Marcus kept his head down, muscle memory from 3 previous schools guiding him through the social minefield. Don't make eye contact. Don't draw attention. Don't give anyone a reason to single you out. He was navigating toward his first period chemistry class, mentally reviewing the periodic table he'd been studying the night before, when a shoulder deliberately slammed into his right side. The impact was calculated, hard enough to send him stumbling, but not so forceful that it couldn't be played off as an accident. His books cascaded across the polished linoleum floor, papers scattering like autumn leaves in a sudden wind. "Watch where you're going, freak." The voice was loud, confident, designed to draw an audience. Tyler Hoffman stood over him, all 6 feet 2 inches of entitled suburban athlete. His perfectly styled blonde hair looked like it belonged in a cologne advertisement, and the Letterman jacket draped over his broad shoulders might as well have been a crown for all the authority it conveyed in these hallways. The jacket bore an impressive collection of patches and pins: varsity football, wrestling team captain, honor roll. Tyler was the kind of student teachers loved and administrators protected, the golden boy who could do no wrong. His cronies flanked him like loyal hounds. Jake Morrison, shorter but stockier, with the build of someone who spent too much time in the gym trying to compensate for other shortcomings. His dark hair was cut military short, and his eyes held the kind of casual cruelty that suggested he enjoyed others' pain. Brett Collins completed the trio, tall and lanky with nervous energy that manifested in constant movement. Cracking knuckles, shifting weight, looking for the next source of entertainment. Marcus silently gathered his scattered belongings, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Each piece of paper was carefully smoothed before being placed back in his folder. His chemistry textbook, its spine already cracked from previous use, was inspected for new damage before being tucked under his arm. Not worth it, he reminded himself, hearing his father's voice echo in his mind. Choose your battles wisely, Marcus. Most fights aren't worth having, and the ones that are will choose you. Did you see that? Jake's voice was deliberately pitched to carry down the hallway. New boy didn't even say anything. What a pushover. The comment drew snickers from passing students, some genuine, others merely performative. The social currency of high school demanding participation in the pecking order. Marcus continued collecting his things, noting the positions of everyone around him without appearing to look. It was a habit drilled into him from childhood, spatial awareness that had become second nature. Tyler stood 3 feet away, weight shifted to his left foot, hands loose at his sides. Jake was to the right, partially blocking the hallway, while Brett lingered behind Tyler's left shoulder. 3 potential threats, dozens of witnesses, 2 security cameras visible in the corridor. His mind catalogued the information automatically, even as he maintained the facade of a scared, overwhelmed teenager. The morning incident set the tone for what would become a systematically escalating campaign of harassment. In his second period English class, Marcus found his assigned seat had been covered in honey, forcing him to stand awkwardly at the back of the room while the teacher, Mrs. Peterson, tried to find cleaning supplies. The giggles and pointed fingers from his classmates burned into his back, but he remained stoic, focusing on the lesson about symbolism in The Great Gatsby. During the 15-minute break between second and third period, Marcus stopped at his locker to exchange textbooks. The lock had been tampered with, superglue filling the mechanism. He worked it carefully, using a paperclip to clear the obstruction while students streamed past, some pausing to watch his struggle with barely concealed amusement. When he finally got it open, a cascade of crumpled paper towels tumbled out, each one bearing crude drawings and insults in different handwriting. Loser. Freak. Go back where you came from. Nobody wants you here. Marcus methodically collected each piece of paper, smoothing them out and placing them in a folder he kept specifically for documentation. His mother had taught him to keep records of everything, a habit born from years of dealing with military bureaucracy and insurance companies after his father's death. Paper trails matter, honey, she would say. Sometimes they're the only proof you have that something happened. In the cafeteria during lunch, Marcus sat alone at a corner table, the social geography of the space as clearly defined as any map. The popular kids occupied the center tables, their position both literal and metaphorical. Athletes dominated the tables near the windows, their Letterman jackets creating a sea of school colors. The arts kids clustered near the stage, discussing their upcoming production of Our Town. The AP students held court near the vending machines, their tables covered in textbooks and SAT prep materials. Marcus's corner table might as well have been in Siberia. He methodically ate his homemade sandwich, peanut butter and grape jelly on wheat bread, the same lunch he'd been eating since elementary school. His mother had offered to give him money for hot lunch, but he declined, knowing how tight their budget was. Besides, the routine was comforting, a small piece of consistency in a life that had seen too much upheaval. He observed the social hierarchy with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying an unfamiliar culture. Tyler's table occupied prime real estate in the absolute center of the room, surrounded by cheerleaders in their practice uniforms, football players still sweaty from morning workouts, and various hangers-on desperate enough to bask in reflected popularity. Tyler held court like a medieval king, his every gesture followed by eager eyes, his jokes met with exaggerated laughter, regardless of their actual humor. "Hey, zombie boy!" Brett's voice cut through the ambient noise, deliberately loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. "You deaf or just stupid?" Marcus continued eating, each bite measured and calm despite the heat rising in his chest. His father had taught him breathing exercises when he was 7 years old, methods for controlling his heart rate and maintaining composure under pressure. In through the nose, hold for 4 counts, out through the mouth. The technique had served him through 3 years of competition jiu-jitsu, through his father's funeral, through countless moments when he wanted to scream or cry or fight. He watched in his peripheral vision as Tyler stood up, his movement causing a ripple effect through the cafeteria. Conversations quieted, heads turned, phones appeared in hands ready to capture whatever entertainment was about to unfold. It was like watching predators respond to movement in the grass, an instinctual recognition that something was about to happen. "I'm talking to you, weirdo," Tyler announced as he crossed the cafeteria with theatrical swagger. His gait was deliberately slow, each step calculated for maximum dramatic effect. Jake and Brett flanked him, their formation practiced from countless similar confrontations. "My friend asked you a question." "I heard him," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady, despite the attention now focused on their interaction. He kept his eyes on his sandwich, refusing to give Tyler the satisfaction of seeing fear or anger. Tyler's face darkened at the perceived disrespect. In his world, the social order demanded that lesser beings show proper deference to their superiors. Marcus's calm response was a violation of the unspoken rules that governed teenage interaction. Without warning, Tyler grabbed Marcus's lunch tray and inverted it, dumping its contents onto the floor. The sandwich split apart on impact, peanut butter and jelly creating an abstract painting on the linoleum. The apple rolled under a nearby table, coming to rest against someone's backpack. The carton of milk burst open, white liquid spreading in an expanding puddle that would surely stain. "Oops," Tyler said with mock innocence, his voice dripping with false concern. "Guess you'll be hungry today." The cafeteria had gone completely silent, the usual chaos replaced by an oppressive stillness. Hundreds of eyes watched, waiting to see how the new kid would respond. Some students had their phones out, recording the interaction for posterity and social media. Others watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief that they weren't the ones in the spotlight. Marcus stared at the ruined meal, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His hands remained flat on the table, but anyone trained in combat would have recognized the subtle shift in his posture, the way his weight redistributed slightly, ready to move in any direction. The teachers at their supervision table seemed absorbed in their own conversations, either genuinely oblivious to the confrontation or deliberately choosing not to notice. He stood slowly, each movement deliberate and controlled. His mother needed him to graduate, to go to college, to make something of himself. Getting expelled for fighting wouldn't help anyone. He gathered his empty tray, stepped carefully around the mess on the floor, and walked toward the disposal area without saying a word. Behind him, Tyler's laughter echoed through the space, soon joined by his followers and several other students emboldened by the lack of consequence. The pattern intensified over the following weeks. Each day brought new humiliations, each one slightly worse than the last. In gym class, Marcus would return from mandatory showers to find his clothes soaked with water, sometimes toilet water based on the smell. His locker was repeatedly vandalized with increasingly creative substances, shaving cream, syrup, mysterious liquids that required extensive cleaning. Crude messages appeared on every surface, some written in permanent marker that required multiple treatments to remove. During group projects, partners would mysteriously request transfers after a day or two, leaving him to complete elaborate presentations alone. Teachers would receive anonymous complaints about his body odor, his supposed inappropriate staring, his alleged cheating on assignments. None of the accusations held up under scrutiny, but the damage to his reputation accumulated like compound interest. Through it all, Marcus maintained his composure with almost supernatural patience. He attended every class, arriving early and sitting in the middle rows where he could observe without being easily targeted. He completed every assignment with meticulous care, his grades remaining consistently high, despite the chaos surrounding him. His teachers saw a quiet, studious young man who never caused trouble, never complained, never asked for special consideration. His classmates saw a victim too weak or too stupid to defend himself. What none of them noticed were the subtle changes beginning to manifest as the weeks passed. The way Marcus's posture gradually straightened, his shoulders pulling back and his chin lifting slightly. How his eyes began tracking movement with increased awareness, cataloging exits, noting potential weapons, identifying threats and allies. The almost imperceptible shift from passive acceptance to active observation, like a predator slowly waking from hibernation. Sarah Chen noticed first. She sat 2 rows behind him in AP English, close enough to observe without being obvious about it. She'd watched the ongoing harassment with growing discomfort, her own experiences with bullying in middle school making her hypersensitive to the dynamics at play. She recognized the careful way Marcus moved through the hallways, always keeping his back to walls, never lingering in open spaces. She saw how he ate lunch with one hand while the other remained free, ready to defend or deflect. She noticed things others missed because she'd once done them herself. Sarah had transferred to Westfield her sophomore year after her parents divorced, and she'd learned to navigate its social waters through careful observation and strategic alliances. She wasn't popular, but she wasn't a target either, existing in that comfortable middle ground where she could move between groups without fully belonging to any of them. She wrote for the school newspaper, ran track in the spring, and maintained a GPA that would get her into a good college. She was, in many ways, exactly what Marcus was trying to be. Invisible enough to avoid attention, but successful enough to have a future. "You don't have to take their crap, you know," she said one afternoon as they walked toward the parking lot. It had been a particularly bad day. Someone had poured chocolate milk into Marcus's backpack during lunch, ruining his chemistry notebook and requiring him to spend his free period in the bathroom trying to salvage what he could. Marcus glanced at her, surprised by the unexpected interaction. People at Westfield had learned that associating with him meant potentially becoming a target themselves. Most kept their distance, offering at best sympathetic looks from across hallways. "I'm fine," he said automatically, the response practiced from dozens of similar conversations with his mother. "No, you're not," Sarah replied with gentle firmness. She adjusted her own backpack, falling into step beside him despite the risk to her own social standing. "Nobody's fine when they're going through what you're going through, but there's something different about you lately, like you're waiting for something." She was more perceptive than he'd given her credit for. Marcus had indeed been waiting, hoping the situation would resolve itself naturally. In his experience, bullies usually got bored and moved on to easier targets if you didn't give them the reaction they wanted. But Tyler and his crew were different. They were escalating, their harassment becoming bolder and more public with each passing day. It was like they were testing boundaries, seeing how far they could push before something broke. "My dad used to say that patience was a virtue," Marcus said carefully, testing how much he could trust this unexpected ally. "My mum says that too," Sarah replied. "But she also says that there's a difference between patience and being a doormat. Sometimes standing up for yourself is the only way to make things stop." They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the distant sound of the marching band practicing for Friday's game. It was the kind of perfect New England afternoon that would have been enjoyable if not for the weight of Marcus's situation. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah ventured as they reached the edge of the parking lot where their paths would diverge. Marcus nodded, curious despite himself. "Where did you learn to move like that? There's something about the way you carry yourself, like you're always ready for something bad to happen." "My cousin does MMA and he moves the same way." Marcus considered his response carefully. He'd kept his training secret at every school, knowing that revealing it would change how people saw him. Either they'd want him to prove it, challenging him to fights he didn't want, or they'd fear him, adding another layer of isolation to his already lonely existence. But something about Sarah's genuine concern made him want to be honest. "My father taught me," he said simply. "He was in the military, special forces. He wanted me to be able to protect myself." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't press for details. She recognized the past tense, the careful way he spoke about his father, and understood that this was painful territory. "That makes sense," she said, "but if you can defend yourself, why let them treat you like this?" It was the question Marcus had been asking himself more frequently as the harassment intensified. Why did he endure it? Why not show them what he was capable of and end it? The answer was complicated, tangled up in promises made to a dying father, in his mother's desperate hope for a normal life, in his own desire to be more than just another violent teenager. "Because once I start, I might not be able to stop," he said honestly, the words surprising them both. Sarah studied his face, seeing something there that made her believe him. This wasn't teenage bravado or empty threats. This was someone who genuinely understood violence and its consequences, who knew what he was capable of and chose restraint anyway. The weeks dragged on with increasing intensity. Tyler's group had moved beyond simple physical harassment and begun targeting Marcus in more creative and psychological ways. They started rumors about his family, suggesting his father had been a coward who'd abandoned them, that his mother worked unsavory jobs to make ends meet, that Marcus himself was dealing drugs or worse. The rumors were obviously false to anyone who bothered to look closely, but high school wasn't a place where truth mattered as much as perception. They stole his homework assignments and turned them in late under his name, earning him zeros that threatened his academic standing. They convinced substitute teachers that he was disruptive and disrespectful, leading to multiple trips to the principal's office where Marcus had to defend himself against fabricated accusations. They even went so far as to create fake social media profiles in his name, posting inflammatory comments that got back to teachers and administrators. The psychological warfare was relentless and methodical, designed to break him down piece by piece. It was clear that Tyler had done this before, that he knew exactly how far he could push without crossing the lines that would bring real consequences. He kept his own hands relatively clean, letting Jake and Brett do most of the direct harassment, while he orchestrated from a distance like a general commanding troops. Marcus's mother, Patricia Dano, had noticed the changes at home. Her son had always been quiet, especially after his father's death. But this was different. He spent long hours in the basement, where they'd set up a makeshift training area years ago. She could hear him working through forms and techniques, the rhythmic sound of controlled breathing and measured movements drifting up through the floorboards. She'd tried to talk to him about school, but Marcus deflected her concerns with vague responses about adjusting to a new environment. She knew he was protecting her, trying to shield her from yet another worry in a life that had already contained too many. Patricia worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat: days at a medical clinic as a receptionist, evenings doing medical transcription from home. She'd aged a decade in the 3 years since her husband's death, grey streaking through her dark hair, lines etching themselves around her eyes. "How was school today, honey?" she would ask each evening, trying to keep her tone light despite the worry that gnawed at her. "Fine, Mom, just the usual," Marcus would reply, forcing a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She wanted to press, to demand real answers, but she also understood her son's need for independence. He'd grown up too fast after his father's death, taking on responsibilities no teenager should have to bear. He did his own laundry, cooked meals when she worked late, maintained the house and yard without being asked. In many ways, he was more adult than child, and she had to respect that even when every maternal instinct screamed at her to protect him. During those late-night training sessions in the basement, Marcus would lose himself in the familiar movements his father had taught him. The basement wasn't large, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with concrete walls and a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. They'd covered the floor with interlocking foam mats, the kind used in professional gyms, a significant investment his father had insisted on before his final deployment. The walls were decorated with certificates and medals from Marcus's competition days, when he'd traveled around New England winning junior division tournaments. There were pictures too, Marcus at 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed while holding a trophy bigger than his torso. At 12, executing perfect armbar on an opponent twice his size. At 14, standing on a podium with a gold medal around his neck. His father beside him with an expression of pure pride. That had been 2 months before the IED that would eventually claim his father's life. David Dano had survived the initial blast, had even been conscious when they medevaced him to Germany, but the damage to his organs had been too severe, the infections too persistent. He'd fought for 2 more years, enduring surgery after surgery, treatment after treatment, before his body finally gave out. Those 2 years had been both a blessing and a curse. Time to say goodbye, but also time to watch a strong man waste away to nothing. Real strength, his father had told him during one of his lucid moments near the end, isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you can endure without becoming like them. Don't let the world make you hard, son. Don't let it take away your compassion. Marcus held onto those words like a lifeline as the situation at Westfield deteriorated. Each day brought new challenges, new humiliations to endure. Tyler and his crew had perfected their harassment into an art form, always staying just shy of anything that would demand administrative intervention. They were careful never to leave marks that wouldn't fade, never to do anything in direct view of cameras, never to put anything in writing that could be traced back to them. The other students at Westfield had settled into their roles as either passive observers or active participants in Marcus's torment. Some genuinely felt bad for him, but were too afraid to intervene. Others seemed to take pleasure in having someone below them on the social ladder, someone whose suffering made their own problems seem smaller. A few, like Sarah, offered quiet support when they could, but even they were careful not to draw too much attention to themselves. Marcus began eating lunch in the library, hoping to avoid the cafeteria confrontations. But Tyler's reach extended everywhere in the school. Books would go missing from his backpack during class. His library card would mysteriously accumulate fines for books he'd never checked out. Even the librarian, Mrs. Foster, usually an ally to quiet students, began viewing him with suspicion after receiving anonymous reports of inappropriate behavior. The breaking point was approaching like a storm system moving across the plains, inevitable and destructive. Marcus could feel it in the escalating boldness of the attacks, in the way Tyler's eyes gleamed with anticipation whenever they crossed paths. Something was building, some final confrontation that would settle things one way or another. It came on a cold Thursday morning in late October. Marcus arrived at school to find a crowd gathered around his locker, their expressions ranging from shock to amusement to sympathy. As he pushed through the crowd, he saw what had drawn their attention. His locker had been forced open overnight, the lock cut with bolt cutters that had been left on the floor like a calling card. But that wasn't the worst part. His textbooks were scattered across the hallway floor, pages torn from their bindings and scattered like confetti. His notebooks had been shredded, weeks of careful notes reduced to illegible scraps. Personal items his mother had packed, a spare jacket for the cold weather, emergency lunch money in a small envelope, a first aid kit she insisted he carry, all destroyed or stolen. But what made Marcus's blood turn to ice was the photograph lying in the center of the destruction. It was the picture he kept in his locker, hidden behind his chemistry textbook where no one should have found it. The photograph showed his father in full military dress uniform, taken the day he received his Silver Star. It was one of the few professional photographs they had of him, one of the only images where he looked healthy and whole before the injuries that would eventually claim him. The photograph had been deliberately vandalized. Someone had drawn obscene images over his father's face, had written "coward" and "baby killer" across the uniform. But worst of all, they'd torn it nearly in half, right through the middle where Marcus stood next to his father, both of them smiling at the camera. Marcus fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he picked up the damaged photograph. For the first time since starting at Westfield, he felt something crack in his carefully maintained composure. This wasn't just bullying anymore, this was desecration. This was an attack on the memory of a man who'd given everything for his country, who'd endured unimaginable pain with dignity and grace. "Looking for this?" Tyler's voice came from behind him, mockingly sweet. Marcus turned slowly to see Tyler holding the torn corner of the photograph, the piece that contained his father's face. Jake and Brett flanked him as usual, their expressions gleeful with anticipated entertainment. A crowd had gathered, phones out, ready to record whatever was about to happen. "Give it back," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. There was something different in his tone now, something that made several nearby students take involuntary steps backward. "What's that?" "I can't hear you, mumble boy," Tyler taunted, holding the photograph fragment higher. "This your daddy? Bet he's real proud of raising such a wimp." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Tyler had done his research, had found Marcus's weakness and was exploiting it with surgical precision. But he'd miscalculated. He'd assumed Marcus's restraint came from weakness, from fear. He didn't understand that it came from strength, from a promise made to a dying father, from a desire to be better than the violence that seemed to solve everything and nothing. "Please," Marcus said quietly, making one last attempt at peaceful resolution. "Just give it back." Tyler's grin widened at what he perceived as begging. He made a show of examining the torn photograph, pretending to read something written on the back. "Says here your dad was a real hero," he said with exaggerated sarcasm. "Guess the apple fell pretty far from the tree, huh?" He dropped the photograph fragment and ground it under his heel with deliberate slowness, the paper crumpling and tearing further under his designer sneaker. The sound it made was barely audible, but to Marcus it might as well have been a gunshot. Something fundamental shifted in Marcus's expression. The careful mask of indifference he'd worn for months dissolved, replaced by something much older and more primal. It wasn't rage exactly. It was colder than that, more controlled. It was the expression his father had worn in combat footage Marcus had found hidden in the attic. The look of someone who had moved beyond emotion into pure purpose. Sarah, watching from her locker 20 feet away, saw the change and felt her breath catch. She'd known Marcus was different, had sensed the coiled potential beneath his quiet exterior, but this was something else entirely. This was transformation happening in real time, chrysalis cracking to reveal what had always been underneath. But Marcus still didn't act. Not yet. He stood slowly, his movements liquid and precise. The crowd seemed to hold its collective breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to occur. Even Tyler's smirk faltered slightly, some primitive part of his brain recognizing a predator where he'd expected prey. The day progressed with electric tension. News of the morning's confrontation spread through the school like wildfire. Everyone knew something was going to happen. They just didn't know when or how. Marcus attended his classes as usual, but there was something different about him now. He moved with unveiled purpose, no longer trying to shrink into himself. Teachers noticed the change, some with concern, others with curiosity. In chemistry class, Mr. Peterson returned the previous week's tests. Marcus had scored perfectly as usual, but someone had gotten to his paper before class. Cheater was written across it in red marker, along with suggestions that he was earning his grades through inappropriate means. Mr. Peterson frowned at the vandalism, but said nothing, simply marking the grade in his book and moving on. The institutional indifference was almost worse than active hostility. During gym class, Marcus found his regular clothes missing entirely, not just soaked, but gone. He had to borrow an ill-fitting spare uniform from the lost and found. The shirt too large and the shorts too small. Coach Williams barely glanced at him, too focused on preparing the varsity football team for Friday's game to care about one student's missing clothes. By lunch period, the entire school was crackling with anticipation. The cafeteria was more crowded than usual, students who normally ate off-campus returning to witness whatever was about to unfold. Marcus sat at his usual isolated table, eating the spare lunch his mother always packed in case his primary meal was destroyed. Peanut butter and jelly again, cut diagonally the way she'd done since he was 5. Tyler stood up from his table with theatrical ceremony, the motion drawing attention from across the room. He'd been building to this all day, saving his grand finale for maximum audience. His followers arranged themselves strategically, Jake blocking one exit, Brett positioned to cut off another escape route. They'd done this before, choreographed humiliation reduced to muscle memory. "Hey, everyone," Tyler announced loudly, his voice carrying over the lunch crowd. "I think our resident freak needs some help with his social skills." A hush fell over the cafeteria like a heavy blanket. Students turned in their seats, some standing for better views. Teachers at their supervision table remained absorbed in their own conversations, either genuinely unaware or deliberately choosing this moment to check their phones, grade papers, look anywhere but at the developing situation. Tyler approached Marcus's table with exaggerated swagger, each step deliberate and measured. His confidence was absolute, built on years of unchallenged dominance in places like this. In his hand, he carried something that made several students gasp, phones immediately rising to record. It was a knife. Not large, perhaps 4 inches of steel, but unmistakably real and dangerous. It wasn't a pocket knife or a utility tool. This was a fixed-blade tactical knife, the kind sold in military surplus stores, the kind designed for one purpose. The fluorescent lights caught the edge, recently sharpened to a mirror finish. "You know what your problem is, psycho," Tyler said, his voice loud enough for the entire cafeteria to hear. "You think you're better than everyone else, walking around all quiet and mysterious like you're some kind of tough guy." Marcus remained perfectly still, but internally, every system in his body shifted into combat mode. His father's training took over, years of muscle memory activating without conscious thought. Distance, 8 feet and closing. Weapon, 4-inch fixed blade, held in untrained grip. Secondary threats, 2, positioned at exits. Witnesses approximately 200. Cameras, 3 visible, possibly more. Exit strategies, multiple, but would require going through at least one aggressor. "I think it's time someone taught you about respect," Tyler continued, the blade glinting as he gestured with it. "Maybe a little scar will help you remember your place." Students began backing away from nearby tables, the circle of space around the confrontation growing wider. Someone should have called for help. Someone should have alerted the authorities. A teacher should have noticed the deadly weapon being brandished in their cafeteria. Instead, they watched with the horrified fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest, unable or unwilling to intervene. Tyler moved closer, the knife now held in what he probably thought was a threatening manner, but which Marcus recognized as amateur hour. The grip was too tight, the angle wrong, the stance completely exposed. Tyler had probably never held a real weapon before, had certainly never been trained in its use. He was playing with forces he didn't understand. "What's wrong, freak? Cat got your tongue?" Tyler taunted, encouraged by Marcus's continued silence. Marcus stood slowly, his movements fluid and controlled. For the first time in months, he looked directly into Tyler's eyes without flinching or looking away. What Tyler saw there made him take an involuntary half-step backward. It wasn't fear or anger or even hatred. It was assessment, the cold calculation of someone determining exactly how much force would be necessary to neutralize a threat. "Put the knife down," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. There was something in the tone that made the hair stand up on the necks of nearby students, a quality that bypassed the conscious mind and spoke directly to primitive survival instincts. Tyler laughed, but it sounded forced now, his confidence cracking at the edges. "Or what? You'll tell your mommy?" "Last warning," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a quality that made several students take additional steps backward. Sarah, watching from across the cafeteria, found herself holding her breath. She'd known this moment was coming, had seen it building for weeks, but knowing something intellectually and witnessing it were entirely different experiences. Tyler lunged forward with the knife, intending what he probably thought would be a threatening gesture rather than an actual attack. He expected panic, pleading, or at least an attempt to run. He expected the same passive acceptance Marcus had shown for months. He expected weakness. What he got instead was 15 years of combat training unleashed with surgical precision. Marcus moved like water, his body flowing around the clumsy attack with an economy of motion that seemed almost choreographed. Time seemed to slow as his training took over completely. His left hand shot out, capturing Tyler's wrist in a grip that locked the joints and controlled the weapon. His right hand formed into a perfect palm strike, connected with the center of Tyler's chest with precisely calculated force. Enough to disable, not enough to cause permanent damage. Tyler's eyes widened in shock as the air exploded from his lungs. The knife clattered to the floor as his grip involuntarily released, the sound of metal on linoleum sharp in the sudden silence. He stumbled backward, gasping like a fish out of water, his face cycling through expressions of surprise, pain, and dawning fear. But Marcus wasn't done. This needed to end definitively, needed to send a message that would prevent any future attempts. His foot swept out in a perfect arc, catching Tyler's legs just below the knees. Physics and gravity took over, sending the would-be attacker crashing to the cafeteria floor with an impact that rattled nearby tables. Jake rushed forward to help his friend, loyalty overcoming common sense. He threw a wild haymaker that would have been embarrassing even in an untrained fight. Marcus slipped inside the arc of the punch, his smaller stature becoming an advantage as he closed distance faster than Jake could react. His hand found Jake's extended arm, fingers wrapping around specific pressure points his father had shown him on anatomical charts. A gentle application of pressure and redirection sent Jake to his knees, crying out in pain and surprise. The arm lock was perfect, controlling the larger boy with minimal effort. Marcus could have broken the arm with another pound of pressure, could have dislocated the shoulder with a slight change of angle. Instead, he held Jake immobilized, letting him feel how helpless he was without causing permanent damage. Brett, seeing his two companions neutralized in a matter of seconds, hesitated at his position by the exit. His face had gone pale, the eager anticipation replaced by naked fear. He looked between Marcus and the door, clearly calculating whether he could escape before becoming the next victim. Marcus released Jake with a gentle push that sent him sprawling, then closed the distance to Brett with 3 quick steps. The taller boy raised his hands in a boxing stance he'd probably learned from watching UFC fights, but his whole body telegraphed his fear. Marcus didn't even need to strike. A simple redirection of Brett's own momentum, combined with a classic hip toss, sent him flying over Marcus's shoulder to crash across an empty table. Lunch trays and abandoned food exploded in all directions, creating a Jackson Pollock painting of cafeteria cuisine. The entire sequence had lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but the cafeteria had gone completely silent, except for the groans of Tyler's crew and the drip of spilled milk hitting the floor. Marcus stood in the center of the chaos, his breathing normal, his posture relaxed but ready. His shirt had come untucked during the movement, and his hair was slightly mussed, but otherwise he looked exactly as he had moments before. Tyler struggled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. His perfect hair was disheveled, his Letterman jacket askew. The golden boy image he'd cultivated so carefully had been shattered in front of the entire school. "You freak! You can't just—" Marcus stepped forward, and Tyler's words died in his throat. There was something in the quiet boy's eyes now, something that promised consequences for any further aggression. It wasn't a threat exactly, it was a statement of fact, as certain as gravity. "You brought a knife to school?" Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent cafeteria. "You threatened to cut me in front of 200 witnesses. You've harassed me for months, destroyed my property, and attacked the memory of my father who died serving this country." He picked up the fallen knife, examining it briefly before setting it on a nearby table where teachers would easily find it. The blade was expensive, well maintained. Tyler had planned this, had brought a weapon to school with the specific intention of using it. "I've been trying to avoid this," Marcus continued, addressing not just Tyler, but the entire room. "I came here wanting to fit in, to make friends, to have a normal senior year. But you wouldn't let that happen. You saw quiet and mistook it for weak. You saw different and decided it meant less than—" Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus held up a hand for silence. The gesture was small, casual, but Tyler found himself unable to speak, as if the words had been stolen from his throat. "I'm not going to hurt you," Marcus said. "Any of you. But this ends now. No more harassment, no more pranks, no more making my life miserable because you think I'm an easy target. I'm not proud of what just happened here. Violence isn't something to celebrate. But sometimes, when someone threatens you with a weapon, when they cross every line of human decency, you do what you have to do to protect yourself." The cafeteria remained frozen in stunned silence. Students who had watched months of harassment without intervention now witnessed its dramatic conclusion. Some appeared ashamed of their previous inaction, their faces flushed with the uncomfortable realization that they'd been complicit through their silence. Others seemed to be experiencing a fundamental shift in their understanding of the social order, watching the careful hierarchy they'd taken for granted crumble in real time. Sarah stepped forward from her position near the wall, moving through the crowd like a ship through water. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice gentle but carrying in the silence. He glanced at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw exhaustion there, and sadness, and something that might have been regret. This wasn't what he'd wanted. This wasn't who he wanted to be. "Where did you learn to do that?" someone called out from the crowd, their voice a mixture of awe and fear. Marcus looked around the room, meeting the eyes of students who had ignored him, mocked him, participated in his torment either actively or through their silence. "My father was Special Forces, 20 years serving his country, multiple deployments, more medals than he could wear. He taught me that violence should only be used to protect yourself or others, never to prove a point, never for revenge, and never to make yourself feel better about your own problems." He looked back at Tyler, who was still struggling to process what had just happened. The hierarchy he'd built his entire identity around had just collapsed, and he looked lost, smaller somehow without the armor of his reputation. "But he also taught me that sometimes when someone threatens you with a weapon, when they've exhausted every other option you've given them, you do what you have to do to survive. He taught me that real strength isn't about hurting people. It's about having the ability to hurt people and choosing not to unless absolutely necessary. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the cafeteria as teachers finally arrived, drawn by reports of a disturbance. Principal Morrison pushed through the crowd of students, his face darkening as he took in the scene. Overturned tables, scattered food, 3 boys looking like they'd been hit by a truck, and Marcus standing calmly in the center of it all. "What happened here?" Principal Morrison demanded, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in education. Multiple voices began speaking at once, students eager to share their version of events. But it was Sarah who stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. "Tyler Hoffman brought a knife to school and threatened Marcus with it," she said, pointing to the weapon still sitting on the table. "Marcus defended himself. There are probably 50 videos of the whole thing." Principal Morrison's expression shifted from anger to alarm as he spotted the knife. This wasn't typical teenage drama anymore. This was a weapon on school property, a criminal matter that would involve police reports, school board meetings, and potential expulsions. "Everyone involved, my office now," he commanded. "The rest of you, lunch is over. Return to your classes." As students began filing out, many paused to look at Marcus with expressions ranging from respect to fear to something approaching understanding. The quiet kid they'd dismissed as weak had just demonstrated capabilities none of them had imagined. But more than that, he'd shown restraint, had used only the force necessary to protect himself, had refused to become the monster that violence so often created. In the hours that followed, statements were taken from dozens of witnesses. Security footage was reviewed, showing every moment of the confrontation in clear detail. The evidence was overwhelming and unambiguous. Tyler had brought a weapon to school with premeditated intent. He had threatened another student with that weapon. Marcus's response had been measured and defensive, using only the force necessary to neutralize the threat. The police were called, as protocol demanded. Tyler was arrested, led out of school in handcuffs while the entire student body watched through classroom windows. The image of the golden boy in custody would become legendary, shared and reshared on social media until it became part of Westfield High folklore. He would face criminal charges for bringing a weapon to school and assault with a deadly weapon. His college prospects, his athletic scholarships, his entire future had evaporated in 10 seconds of poor judgment. Jake and Brett received lesser punishments, suspensions, community service, mandatory counseling. They'd been followers rather than leaders, but they'd still participated in months of harassment that the investigation would uncover in disturbing detail. Other students came forward with their own stories of Tyler's bullying, creating a pattern of behavior that stretched back years. Marcus spent hours in the principal's office, then the police station, then with the school board's emergency session. His mother arrived within an hour of being called, her face a mixture of concern, pride, and exhaustion. She sat beside him through every interview, her hand occasionally touching his shoulder in silent support. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked during a break in the questioning. "You have enough to worry about," Marcus replied, the same answer he'd given himself 100 times. "Oh, honey," she said, pulling him into a hug that he finally allowed himself to accept. "I'm your mother. Worrying about you is my job, and your father, he would be so proud of how you handled this. You showed exactly the kind of strength he always talked about." The school's response was swift and comprehensive. A zero-tolerance policy for weapons was already in place, but they expanded it to include more serious consequences for bullying and harassment. Teachers received additional training on recognizing and intervening in student conflicts. Security measures were increased, with more cameras and regular locker checks. But the more significant change was in the student body itself. Marcus's stand had broken something loose in the social dynamics of Westfield High. Other victims of bullying found courage in his example, coming forward with their own stories. The rigid hierarchy that had allowed Tyler and others like him to operate with impunity began to crumble. Marcus discovered that respect could indeed be earned in a single moment of truth, but he also learned that respect wasn't the same as friendship. Students who had previously ignored or mocked him now nodded respectfully in the hallways, but there was distance in their acknowledgement. He'd become something outside their normal understanding, neither victim nor bully, but something more complex. Sarah, however, became his first real friend at Westfield High. She'd seen him at his lowest and highest points, had witnessed both his restraint and his capability. She understood that the quiet boy who sat reading in the library and the warrior who dismantled 3 attackers were the same person, just different facets of a complex whole. "You know," she said one afternoon as they walked through the halls together, "I don't think anyone's going to mess with you again." Marcus smiled ruefully. "That was never the point. I just wanted to be left alone to do my work and graduate." "Well, mission accomplished. But now you have something else." "What's that?" "Friends. Real ones. People who respect you for who you are, not because they're afraid of you." She was right. Slowly, carefully, Marcus began building actual relationships with his classmates. Students who had been too afraid to approach him before now felt safe engaging. The chess club invited him to join after learning about his strategic thinking. The wrestling coach tried to recruit him, though Marcus politely declined, having had enough of combat sports for a lifetime. He found study partners for his AP classes, lab partners who actually contributed to projects, lunch companions who included him in their conversations. It wasn't the normal senior year he'd originally hoped for, but it was something better. Authentic connections built on mutual respect rather than social convenience. Tyler, humbled by his public defeat and facing serious legal consequences, eventually approached Marcus with something resembling an apology. It happened in the courthouse hallway during a break in proceedings, their lawyers conferring nearby about potential plea deals. "I didn't know," Tyler mumbled, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. "About your dad, I mean. And the training stuff. I thought—" "You thought I was weak," Marcus finished for him. "An easy target to make yourself feel powerful." Tyler nodded miserably. He'd lost everything: his position at school, his athletic future, his friends who distanced themselves from him once he could no longer provide social capital. "Yeah, I was wrong." Marcus studied him for a long moment. Tyler looked smaller now, diminished without his coterie and reputation. The designer clothes and perfect hair remained, but they seemed like costume pieces for a play that had ended. "It wouldn't have mattered if you had known," Marcus said finally. "What you did was wrong, regardless of whether you thought you could get away with it. You brought a knife to school. You threatened to cut me. That's not bullying anymore. That's assault with a deadly weapon." "I know," Tyler whispered. I wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it. The harassment, the lies, your dad's picture, especially that was—" He trailed off, unable to find words adequate to describe the cruelty of that particular act. Marcus felt no satisfaction in Tyler's misery, no joy in his downfall. If anything, he felt sad. Sad that it had come to this. Sad that Tyler had needed to be stopped rather than choosing to stop himself. Sad that so many people had been hurt by one person's need to feel superior. "I hope you learn from this," Marcus said. "I hope when you get through whatever consequences are coming, you become someone better. Someone your own father would be proud of." Tyler flinched at the reference to fathers, understanding now what he'd attacked when he'd destroyed that photograph. He nodded once more and walked away, shoulders slumped under the weight of consequences he'd never imagined facing. As spring arrived and Marcus's senior year drew to a close, he reflected on the lessons learned during his time at Westfield High. He'd discovered that avoiding conflict wasn't always possible, but how you handled unavoidable confrontations defined your character. He'd learned that true strength wasn't about never fighting, but about knowing when fighting was the only option left. The cafeteria, where everything had changed, still served as the social hub of the school, but the atmosphere was different now. The rigid hierarchy had given way to a more fluid social structure. Tables that had been strictly segregated by clique now showed more mixing. The culture of bullying that had been tacitly accepted was now actively confronted. Marcus still preferred his quiet corner table, but now it was by choice rather than necessity. Sarah usually joined him, along with a rotating cast of others who'd become friends over the months. They discussed college plans, debated philosophical questions from their English class, complained about calculus homework, shared the normal concerns of teenagers preparing for the next phase of their lives. "So," Sarah said one day as they sat together, acceptance letters spread across the table, "where are you thinking of going?" Marcus considered the options before him. His grades were excellent. His application essay about overcoming adversity without losing compassion had impressed admissions officers, and several universities had offered substantial scholarships. The incident with Tyler, rather than hurting his prospects, had actually helped once the full context was understood. Here was a young man who had shown remarkable restraint in the face of persistent harassment, who had defended himself only when threatened with a weapon, who had used minimal force to resolve a dangerous situation. "Somewhere I can study to become a teacher," he replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Maybe coach too. Work with kids who need someone to believe in them, someone who understands that different doesn't mean less than." Sarah smiled. "Your dad would be proud." Marcus touched the wallet in his pocket, feeling the outline of the repaired photograph now carefully laminated to prevent further damage. He'd painstakingly taped it back together, and while the tear lines were still visible, the image was whole again. His father looked back at him from that photograph with the same quiet strength that had carried Marcus through his darkest moments at Westfield High. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think he would be." The final bell of the year rang on a beautiful June afternoon. Students flooded out of classrooms, voices raised in celebration of summer freedom. Yearbooks were passed around for signatures. Promises to keep in touch were exchanged with varying degrees of sincerity. Tears were shed over impending separations. Marcus walked through the hallways one last time, taking in the lockers that had been sites of harassment, the cafeteria where everything had changed, the gym where he'd endured so much. But instead of bitter memories, he felt a sense of completion. He'd been tested here, pushed to his limits and beyond, and he'd emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. At his locker, now unmarred by vandalism, he collected the last of his belongings. The chemistry textbook he'd studied so diligently, the notebooks filled with careful notes, the novel from English class with his thoughtful annotations in the margins. Each item was placed carefully in his father's old military backpack, the worn fabric holding up despite everything it had been through. "Ready for this?" Sarah asked, appearing beside him as the hallway emptied. "Ready for what?" "The rest of our lives," she said with a dramatic flourish that made them both laugh. As they walked toward the exit, other students nodded respectfully. Some offered congratulations on college acceptances, others simply acknowledged him with the kind of recognition reserved for those who'd proven themselves in meaningful ways. Marcus returned each gesture with quiet grace, neither dwelling on the past nor forgetting its lessons. Near the main entrance, he encountered Coach Williams, who'd largely ignored him during the months of harassment. The older man cleared his throat awkwardly. "Delano, Marcus. I wanted to say, I should have done more. Seen what was happening. I'm sorry." It was an unexpected admission from someone who rarely acknowledged mistakes. Marcus appreciated the courage it took to offer it. We all could have done things differently, Coach. The important thing is learning from it. Coach Williams nodded, seeming relieved by the response. You'd have made a hell of a wrestler, you know. That takedown of Hoffman was textbook perfect. Thanks, Marcus said, but I've had enough fighting for a lifetime. Outside, the June sun was warm on his face, the air filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. Parents waited in cars, honking congratulations. Friends embraced, promised to stay in touch, took one last selfie in front of the school sign. Marcus's mother waited in their old Honda, the same car that had brought him here on that first day that seemed simultaneously like yesterday and a lifetime ago. She smiled as he approached, and he could see pride in her eyes. Not for the fighting, but for the young man he'd become through trials she wished he'd never had to face. "How does it feel?" she asked as he slid into the passenger seat. "Like an ending," he said, then reconsidered. "No, like a beginning, like I'm finally ready for whatever comes next." As they drove away from Westfield High for the last time, Marcus thought about the path that had brought him here. The quiet boy who'd walked through those doors months ago, hoping to remain invisible, had discovered that invisibility wasn't always possible or even desirable. Sometimes you had to stand up and be seen, had to declare your worth in ways that couldn't be ignored. He'd learned that real strength wasn't about proving you could hurt someone. It was about knowing you could, but choosing not to unless absolutely necessary. It was about protecting others, even when they hadn't protected you. It was about maintaining your humanity in situations designed to strip it away. His father's lessons had finally made complete sense, tested in the crucible of real-world conflict and emerging more valuable than ever. The techniques and forms practiced in that basement had served their purpose, but more importantly, the philosophy behind them had proven its worth. Violence as a last resort, strength used for protection, not domination. The warrior who chooses peace until peace is no longer an option. Years later, Marcus would indeed become a teacher, working in inner-city schools where bullying and violence were endemic. He would recognize the Tyler Hoffmans of the world, understanding that bullies were often victims themselves, lashing out from their own pain and insecurity. He would also recognize the quiet kids in the corner, the ones everyone dismissed as weak or weird, and he would make sure they knew someone was watching, someone cared, someone would intervene if lines were crossed. He would tell his students about his experience at Westfield High, though he'd changed names and certain details. He'd explain how he'd tried everything to avoid violence, how he'd endured months of harassment, hoping for a peaceful resolution. But he'd also tell them about the moment when he had to choose between his safety and his principles, and how sometimes those weren't opposing forces, but the same thing viewed from different angles. Most importantly, he'd teach them what his father had taught him, that real strength wasn't about what you could do to others, but what you could endure without becoming like them. That everyone deserved respect until they proved otherwise. That violence should never be the first answer, or the second, or even the third, but that sometimes, when someone threatens you with a weapon, when they've exhausted every chance you've given them, you do what you have to do to survive. The transformation from victim to survivor to protector was complete. Marcus Delano had walked into Westfield High as a scared boy, trying to remain invisible, and walked out as a young man who understood his own worth. He'd been tested in ways no teenager should have to be tested, had faced choices no one should have to face, and had emerged with his principles and humanity intact. That was the real victory. Not the 10 seconds of combat in a high school cafeteria, not the humiliation of his tormentors, not even the respect he'd earned from his peers. The real victory was remaining true to his father's teachings while still protecting himself, maintaining his compassion while enforcing his boundaries, choosing peace while being capable of war. As he would tell his own students years later, standing in front of a classroom filled with young people facing their own battles, Being different isn't a weakness to hide. It's a strength to embrace. And sometimes the quiet kid in the corner has more courage than anyone else in the room. They just haven't had to show it yet. The story of what happened in that cafeteria would become legend at Westfield High, told and retold with various embellishments over the years. But for Marcus, it wasn't about becoming a legend or a hero or even a cautionary tale. It was about a moment when he had to choose between remaining a victim and becoming something else. And he'd chosen to become himself, fully, authentically, unapologetically. And in the end, that was all any of us could hope to do: face our trials with dignity, stand up for ourselves when necessary, protect others when possible, and emerge from our crucibles not unscathed, but unbroken, not unchanged, but still recognizably ourselves. Marcus Delano had been tested at Westfield High School. He'd faced bullies and violence and the temptation to become what he fought against. He'd been pushed to his limits and beyond, but he'd survived, thrived even, and carried forward the lessons learned in those hallways and that cafeteria. The quiet boy who'd tried so hard to remain invisible had become a man who understood that sometimes visibility was necessary, that sometimes standing up meant standing out, and that true strength wasn't about never fighting, but about knowing when fighting was the only option left. His father would have been proud. His mother was proud. And finally, Marcus was proud of himself, not for the violence, never for that, but for maintaining his humanity through it all, for refusing to let the world make him hard, for keeping his compassion even when faced with cruelty. That was the real lesson of Westfield High. That was the story worth telling, and that was the legacy Marcus would carry forward into whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that he'd been tested and hadn't just survived, but had remained true to the principles that mattered most. The boy who'd walked into Westfield High hoping to remain invisible had walked out visible, respected and understood, but more importantly, he'd walked out as himself, just more fully realized, more confident, more aware of his own capabilities and responsibilities. And that transformation, that journey from hidden to seen, from victim to survivor, from passive to purposefully restrained, that was the education that mattered most. Not the chemistry formulas, or literary analysis, or mathematical proofs, valuable as those were, but the lesson in being human in a world that sometimes seemed designed to strip away humanity. Marcus Delano had learned that lesson at Westfield High School, learned it through pain and patience, through restraint and eventually through necessary action. And he would carry that lesson forward, sharing it with others who needed to hear it, becoming the teacher and protector his father had always known he could be. The story ended where it began, with a young man walking through school doors. But everything had changed in between. Not just circumstances, but understanding. Not just reputation, but character. Not just survival, but growth. And that growth, painful as it had been, was the true gift of his time at Westfield High. He'd discovered who he was when pushed to his limits. He'd learned what he stood for when standing became necessary. He'd found his strength not in his ability to fight, but in his ability to choose when fighting was worth it. Those 10 seconds in the cafeteria had changed everything and nothing. Everything because they'd shattered the social order that had made his life miserable. Nothing because they'd only revealed what had always been there, a young man of principle and capability who chose peace until peace was no longer possible. That was Marcus Delano's story at Westfield High School, a story of bullying faced and overcome, a story of violence as a last resort, a story of strength defined not by what you could do, but by what you chose to do, a story of a boy becoming a man not through conquest, but through restraint, not through dominance, but through discipline, not through cruelty, but through maintaining compassion, even in the face of cruelty. It was, in the end, a very human story, and that's what made it worth telling.